Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Alina Brickman, and I'm the Director of EU Affairs at B'nai International. Thank you for joining us today for this important occasion to commemorate the November pogroms. On this day, 82 years ago, the Nazis unleashed pogroms against Jews across Germany, Austria, and parts of the Czech Republic. Jewish institutions, homes, businesses, hospitals, schools were all vandalized. Upward of 1,000 synagogues were destroyed, set on fire. Hundreds of people were beaten and even killed, and 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Indeed, the November pogroms were a turning point when legal discrimination turned more abruptly to violent physical persecution. They were also a microcosm of the response of society at large, those who condemned, those who stood by, and those who participated. 82 years after the November pogroms, this dark episode continues to remain a source of learning for a world which is tasked with the mission to prevent genocide. As President Rivlin, the President of the State of Israel, eloquently noted in his message to B'nai B'rith International on this 82nd commemoration of the November pogroms, where he pays kind tribute to B'nai B'rith's fervent work to protect the Jewish community before, during, and after the Holocaust. We Jews may have been the victims in 1938 and in the tragic years that followed, but racism, hatred, and xenophobia are plagues on all of us. We must oppose them, denounce them, and root them out of our societies. So preventing genocide requires permanent vigilance and sustained effort. It requires that we build resilient societies that are committed to human rights and the rule of law and embrace diversity and pluralism. And while this is a task that at times nation states and the international community have failed to live up to, even after the Holocaust, it remains our fundamental responsibility and the priority for all of us. Genocide prevention is thus an exercise for nations, for international bodies, but also for civil society and individual citizens. And to discuss this with us today are three illustrious speakers, and I will invite my colleague Ilan Selby to introduce them.
Thank you, Alina. We're honored to have with us today Professor Yehuda Bauer. Professor Bauer is Professor Emeritus of History and Holocaust Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, academic advisor to Yad Vashem, honorary chairman of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and one of the world's foremost scholars of the Holocaust. Professor Bauer's vast work expands beyond the history of the Holocaust to the area of genocide prevention, and it's on this topic that we'll hear from him today. Following Professor Bauer's intervention, we're pleased to have with us today two outstanding panelists whose essential work on Holocaust remembrance and genocide prevention enriches our collective capacity to stand against hatred in our societies today. Olivia Marks-Woldman, OBE, is the Chief Executive of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust in the UK, having been in the role since 2012. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust encourages remembrance in a world scarred by genocide and brings in civil society to learn more about the past and take actions to create a safer future. Dr. James Waller has been the Academic Programs Director of the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities since 2012. The Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide supports states to develop or strengthen policies and practices for the prevention of genocide and other mass atrocities, and encourages and supports the cooperation of states through regional and international networks to advance prevention. Dr. Waller is an author and Cohen Professor for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Thank you all for being with us today, and now please allow me to give the floor to Professor Bauer for his introductory remarks. Professor Bauer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. On the 9th of December 1948, the United Nations had been established just 3 years before, unanimously passed the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And the definition that it offered was the intent and action to annihilate an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group as such, in whole or in part. In whole, 3 years after the end of World War II obviously meant the Jews. In part, most probably meant the Poles. Now, there's a problem, a major problem with its definition, which is part of international law. The problem is, for instance, that it mentions racial groups, but there are no racial groups. All humanity originates from East Africa, and a chief of a tribe in Papua New Guinea who should win the heart of a lady professor at London University, and they establish a family, their children would be perfectly normal because we are one race. There are no races. In 1948, it made some sense because Churchill, for instance, referred to the English race and the German race and the Russian race and so on. And he meant what we today call ethnicity or nationality. But in 2020, to talk about racial groups may reek of racism. So that's one problem. The other major problem, of course, is the fact that there may be mass annihilation of groups outside of ethnic, national, racial, or religious groups, political groups, economic groups, ideological groups, and so on. Now, considering that, some academics suggested to use the term politicide. In other words, the intent and action to annihilate a political, economic, social, ideological group as such in whole or in part. That was proposed in 1988 by Professor Barbara Harff, Harff, of the United States, and her husband, Ted Gurr, Gurr, was repeated in 2003. And a number of governments and academic institutions accepted that. But of course, that is not part of international law. Now, international law is very important, but it is selectively used. The major powers and quite a number of smaller powers and states adhere to international law when it's useful. They don't adhere to it. They ignore it completely when it opposes their interests, which doesn't mean to say that we should have less international law or that we should try to abolish it. No, the opposite is true. We should strengthen it. But it's a work in progress. It's not something that's there. International law is a proposal which has been accepted in word by all countries, all states, and in theory and in practice ignored. So international law is both very important, and one has to look at it with a very practical eye. Now, there's another issue there, that even that, if you add politicide, which is not international law, to the definition of 1948, it's again not quite enough. There are cases where even that is not quite clear. And so in 2007, another American academic, David J. Scheffer, Scheffer, suggested to use a term which was already in use, namely mass atrocity crimes. And by that he meant four things: war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, when the purpose is not just the deportation of a group, but its annihilation, and genocide according to convention plus politicide. Now, mass atrocity crimes, he suggested, should not eliminate these four kinds. It should continue to use them because there are cases where they are obviously adaptable to the reality, as in the case of the Holocaust, which is perfectly clear was a genocide according to the convention. But one should be very careful and say that while all these four cases should remain as they are. There are many cases, and generally the term of mass atrocity crimes encompasses all these four. Why is that important? Because the action of genocide prevention as part of the action of preventing mass atrocity crimes points to the fact that the way that we deal with genocide prevention is, basically speaking, the same that we should deal with the other three types of mass atrocity crimes. Now, who has accepted that? Well, obviously, there's a problem, a political problem, a social and political problem, which was picked up, as it happens, by the Swiss government in 2008. And it appointed a special envoy, a diplomat. Her name is Mo Bleeker, B-L-E-E-K-E-R. And she began to organize a political background to try to address the problem of mass atrocity crimes, including as its base genocide prevention. And because it's 2008 that she started, she based her whole approach on the obvious case of genocide in the 20th century, namely the Holocaust. So the Holocaust has become a starting point for this whole effort to deal with mass atrocity crimes. The first diplomatic meeting, took place in December 2008 in Buenos Aires. And then further meetings took place in Arusha in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, in Manila in the Philippines, and the next meeting will happen by something that was created out of that in 2015, which is called Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes, GAAMAC, because everybody likes these, these letters. And the next meeting, the fourth meeting of GAAMAC, will take place in The Hague in the Netherlands in November of next year, hopefully already with the corona behind us, hopefully. Now, the last meeting of GAAMAC took place in Kampala in Uganda a year and a half ago, and encompassed 36 governments that agreed with the definition of not only of mass atrocity crimes, but what to do about it, which you can follow on Google. If you Google GAAMAC, GAAMAC.org, you will see the document itself. Now, the GAAMAC effort is an effort that does not include most of European countries and states. It's only Sweden, Switzerland, now lately also Sweden, and Denmark. And out of that, including the UK, and of course the US and Russia and China and so on and so forth, are not participating in this. Most of the 36 governments come from Africa and Asia and so on and so forth. And it's very important to notice that the idea, the general idea behind GAAMAC, the overall idea, is that with the situation at the United Nations as it is, where the Security Council is the problem and not a solution, there needs to be a pressure on the Security Council through the United Nations General Assembly. And for that, you need a large number of committed governments that may disagree with each other on any subject under the sun, but will agree on this, to press the Security Council to actually do some action to prevent genocide when it threatens. In order to do that, you need an academic background. You need organizations, groups, individuals who will define what is happening in the world, who with statistical means, with a connection of political science, statistics, and various other disciplines, will determine where the danger lies, where in the world there's a real danger of an outbreak of atrocity crimes. Let me put you a case in point. In Myanmar, there have been elections just now. The party led by Daw San Suu Kyi got a majority. But she denies the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims in the western part of Myanmar. And that is clearly a case of mass atrocity crime. But it is also a case, one can argue, according to the definition of 1948, it's also a case of genocide. How do you prevent that? You can't prevent that just by one country. You can't prevent it by people of goodwill in the West, because the danger doesn't come from Britain. It doesn't come from the Netherlands. It doesn't come from Canada. It doesn't come from Germany. It doesn't come from Italy. It comes from dictatorships, from nationalist governments that will do anything to fortify their positions and will create a usable past which will deny or distort the past in order to strengthen a nationalist presence. Now that's the general issue. And the leadership of Garmak will change in another 2 weeks' time when Mo Bleeker leaves her position as a general secretary of Garmak, and the new general secretary will be an Argentinian, Judge Silvia Fernandez de Gourmendi, who was a judge in the International Court of Hague until quite recently, and is now working for the Argentinian Foreign Office. She's also the representative of Argentina on IRA, on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, of which I happen to be the honorary president, honorary chairman. Now you see, there is a clear connection between Holocaust remembrance and Garmak. In fact, IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is a member of Garmak. And so the things had combined. Why do they combine? Because genocide is not something new. Genocide has been with humanity since the very beginning of humanity. Groups of humans have been killing other groups of humans since time immemorial in order to better their way of living, their standard of living, the environment in which they lived. Now, not only murder, not only genocide, also other forms of a meeting between human groups that we have seen over the period of the past. The possibility of absorbing another group, the possibility of enslaving another group without murdering it, the possibility of deporting another group without necessarily destroying it. Murder, but there's also a fifth option: to live alongside each other without killing each other, without being enemies with each other, and over time, maybe even forming alliance with each other. England, not Scotland, England and France are a very good example. Hundreds of years of bitter enmity. But today, the idea of Mr. Boris Johnson declaring war on Emmanuel Macron is simply an impossibility. The same applies to France and Germany. The same applies in Asia, for instance, between Thailand and Cambodia. Or the same applies to Paraguay and Brazil, where there was terrible enmity in the past, but people, for a number of reasons, historically explicable, and I don't have time to deal with it, have managed to overcome that. Now, what we have to deal when we talk about genocide prevention is certainly based on the Holocaust, but it deals with that fifth option, the possibility of overcoming it, not by the effort of one country, as Mark is trying to do by uniting otherwise not necessarily allied states and governments in order to prevent the worst, to prevent mutual mass killings, to prevent mass atrocities, to prevent mass rape, to prevent mass killing of children, all of which has happened and is happening, We are faced with genocide today, in various parts of the world, because we have not managed to overcome this problem of the major powers and some smaller ones trying to get what they want by killing the others. Now, we are living in a very, very difficult world. A world in which, true, the recent elections in the United States have shown that a liberal element, a liberal democratic element, can win the electoral battle in a country. That's true. But friends, in the United States, 70 million Americans voted for Trump. 70 million. They're not going to disappear. And approaches like that are to be found all over the world. The liberal answer against illiberalism, and illiberalism is a dictatorship in China. It's the dictatorship plus a kind of democratic veneer in Russia. It's a number of countries in Europe. It's a number of countries in Latin America. It's the nationalism in India. It's a dictatorship in Thailand, and so on and so forth. We are not living in an easy world, and it's not left and right. It's not left and right. The regimes of Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba are supposedly left. They are dictatorships, murderous dictatorships. And the leadership in Europe of the liberal world is in the hands of the head of a conservative party in Germany. The leadership in the Scandinavian countries is in the hands of women, liberal democratic women in Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. You see, we have to combine these things. Genocide prevention is possible. It is not inevitable. It's a choice. And the way to deal with it, from the point of view of B'nai B'rith, of a Jewish organization, whatever the Jewish organization is to find allies. We can't do it alone, just as we cannot fight anti-Semitism alone. We have to fight for the good cause by creating alliances with liberal religion, radical conservative Catholics support nationalism. The Vatican does not. The Vatican is a liberal religion, if one can use that term. In the Muslim world, there's a majority of the intellectual class in many Arab countries, many Muslim countries, which is violently anti-Semitic, violently genocidal, yes? But in the Muslim countries, there's also the opposite, an opposition to this, seeking to create alliances with like-minded countries and other countries. So genocide prevention is a possibility. It's a possibility we have. It's a, whether we will succeed in winning this battle, I have no way of knowing. We may lose it. We may lose it. We may descend into a chaotic situation of everyone against everyone. A situation where the Uyghurs of the Western Chinese province of Xinjiang are, practically speaking, genocidally attacked and eliminated by communist China. Communism in China is about as relevant to China as, I don't know, zebras are. Communism is just a slogan. It's nationalism, it's Chinese nationalism. In Russia, there is a defense of the past, of an indefensible past, that might justify the present in its attempt to conquer parts of the Ukraine, the Crimea, the intervention in Syria, and so on. And there are many other cases like that. What we need to do is, genocide prevention is a matter of alliances. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bauer, for that introduction and bringing forward the idea of genocide as a legal concept, as something that is dealt with in a legal framework, introducing us to the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes initiative that we're inviting everyone to take a look at and dig deeper into. But also, speaking of the fact that genocide is something that is ongoing today and pointing out to worrying cases worldwide. But what I appreciate most is perhaps this rather positive thought that you've left us with, that genocide is something that we can overcome, that it's possible to overcome genocide, and we need to collectively on an international level make that commitment. I'd also like to just acknowledge the enormous breadth of your work on genocide prevention, but also advising organizations and governments, talking with young people and equipping them with the tools necessary to be aware and to identify and to act when they see hate. And that is something that is invaluable, and we are really honored that you started us off on this discussion today. So thank you very, very much for that. So let us now continue to our two panelists. And the organizations they represent do very particular and very targeted work. And we believe that this work essentially very nicely complements each other. And so we wanted to begin our discussion by having each of them give a short presentation that speaks to the angle from which their organization tackles the important mission of genocide prevention. So Dr. Waller will speak on the topic of why the November pogroms matter today. And Ms. Marks-Woldman will talk to us about why collective responsibility is important and what that might actually look like in practice. So Dr. Waller, please, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Alina. And thank you, Professor Bauer, for your comments, challenging and insightful as always. And thank you to the organizers for having a chance to speak with you briefly today as well. I'm very pleased to be representing here my home institution of Keene State University in New Hampshire, home to the US's only undergraduate major in Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at our campus, and also in my role as Director of Academic Programs at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, where over the years, we've trained now well over 5,000 government, military, security sector personnel from more than 85 different countries on issues related to genocide and atrocity prevention. I'm going to frame my brief remarks around two words or two concepts. One is process and the other is action. One of the things we believe very deeply at the Auschwitz Institute is that mass atrocity crimes, be they genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity, unfold as processes. In other words, we never start at the end in trying to understand or prevent these events, because the end state, the destruction of life, the extermination, the destruction of culture and religious life, that end state is the culmination of a long, winding process that has led to it. For us, that process piece is incredibly important to understand, because if all we do is start off at the end state, the event of destruction, it's very easy to put one's head in one's hands and just say, we have no idea how to prevent this from happening, because you're starting at the ending. We prefer to start at the beginning and think about the unfolding process by which these things happen, by which these things escalate, the classification, the dehumanization, the state-sponsored violence in terms of legal disenfranchisement, economic expropriation, the actual state or non-state involvement in violence. When we think about it as a process, what's important for us from the standpoint of prevention is that the process piece and understanding allows us to think about all the different points of prevention that could have taken place along that process. So for instance, today we commemorate Kristallnacht, not because it was the end state of what the Holocaust would become, but because it was, as was said in the introduction, a turning point in the process. It was a point of radicalization. And Kristallnacht was something that absolutely the international community recognized. And the international community expressed outrage about what had happened in Kristallnacht, in the pogrom. But what the international community was hesitant to do was to engage in action, to engage in preventive action, in part because they likely didn't see it as a step in the process or didn't recognize how far down the road that process would go. So that takes me to my second word I want us to focus on. In addition to process is action. What steps, what action can we take to inhibit the process of unfolding genocide and mass atrocity? At the Auschwitz Institute and in my own work, I focus very much on the action steps in prevention as occurring at three different stages. One stage is what we call upstream or primary prevention. This is the work of prevention we do before any atrocity unfolds. It's the important work of building strong societies, resilient democracies, inclusive economies that give people the opportunity to fulfill their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Upstream prevention is the most important preventive work we can do, because we're saying we're not going to wait for atrocity to unfold. We're not going to wait for the crisis to happen. We're going to build the strong, stable, inclusive societies that make those events unlikely to happen. But upstream prevention is not the only form of action. It's not the only form of prevention. If upstream prevention fails or is not as successful as it should be, and we have crisis, as we do in Ethiopia, as we do in China, as we do in Myanmar, as we continue to see in South Sudan, when we have those moments of crisis, that's not the time to put our hands aside and say, there's no more prevention to be done. We're absolutely still doing the work of prevention, but now it's come what we call midstream, our secondary prevention, because now we're in the middle of it. We're in the middle of the crisis. We have fewer tools to prevent, and prevention's more costly, but we still are working on prevention. We're looking at legal tools to prevent the escalation of atrocities. We're looking at economic tools. We're looking at diplomatic tools and occasionally even at military tools. But the point is that we're still trying to prevent the atrocity from getting worse. And then once the killing is over, perhaps we've been successful at midstream prevention, perhaps even upstream prevention has made the society more resilient. But once the killing is over, then we're in our third stage of prevention, our third action steps, which are downstream prevention, our tertiary prevention. This is, how do we rebuild the society? So it makes it unlikely for this to happen again in this society, because we know that the occurrence of genocide in a society is a significant risk factor affecting future instability. So how do we rebuild these societies that have torn themselves apart? What role does justice play? What does justice look like? Is it restorative? Is it retributive? A combination of both? What role does truth play in rebuilding the society? What role does memory play? The point of all of these tools, justice, truth, and memory, is that they're all preventive measures. We're trying to prevent a society from relapsing into the type of violence from which it's come. So again, for me, the important issues we work on in prevention are understanding it as a process, but then also understanding the action steps before, during, and after. Upstream, midstream, downstream, it's a cycle. So when it's seen in this way, the question isn't, when do we prevent? The answer is, we're always preventing. We're always involved in some type of preventive work. And as Professor Bauer says, all three forms of those prevention require us. They mandate that we have the alliances among lawyers, among politicians, among academics, among civil society to take the preventive steps necessary to make never again a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Waller, for that introduction, and we will certainly come back to some of the points that you mentioned, particularly in this distinction between process and action, and we're going to speak to both of those. But first, let me turn to Ms. Marks-Woldman for her introductory remarks. Olivia.
Thank you so much, Alina, and thank you too, of course, to James and to Yehuda for such interesting and such thought-provoking remarks from you both. I'm going to start talking at the civil society end of the conversation and to pick up on some of the points that have been made already and delve into it from that civil society aspect. And I'm going to start with the phrase that's in the title that Alina has posed for this conversation: Genocide Prevention, a collective responsibility. Why is collective responsibility quite so important when we're talking about genocide prevention? And I want to start the answer with the Stockholm Declaration, which is, of course, the declaration that underpins Holocaust Memorial Day and underpins so much Holocaust education and commemoration activity that is taking place today. The Stockholm Declaration described the Holocaust as an episode that shook the foundations of civilization. It shook the foundations of civilization. I find this a very powerful phrase. The Holocaust threatened what it means to live in a civilized society. But it didn't only shake the civilization, it shook what civilization is founded on. Humanity, culture, bonds of society, social contract. And therefore, any future such genocide must be prevented by this social collective action. Recent events have shown us just how very fragile civilization continues to be. In many countries in recent years, the rise of populism and the associated division, hostility, hatred, prejudice are alerting us to the fragility of our accepted norms of what constitutes civilized behavior. So we must respond with action that is not only individual action and commitment, but also collective action. We've heard already from Yehuda and from James how necessary those formal alliances are. And I'm talking, when I use the phrase collective action, not only those formal alliances between nation state and nation state, between organizations such as B'nai B'rith and other organizations, but also informal networks and solidarity with people in other communities. Just as an example, I'm a member of a wonderful organization in the UK called Nisa Nashim, founded by our own chairperson, Laura Marks, and her friend Julie Siddiqui. It brings together Jewish and Muslim women who often do not have many forums and opportunities to meet, brings us together within a formalized network, but so that we can focus on building relationships. So networks such as these, as well as formal alliances, but is not only developing these friendships and relationships, it is translating that into action. Individual and collective responsibility must translate to action. At the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, we have a vision for Holocaust Memorial Day that people will learn more about genocide for a better future. It has this dual aspect. We are commemorating and reflecting on the past for a purpose, for a better future. In the UK, Holocaust Memorial Day is marked in literally thousands of activities, thousands of organizations. And at the heart of all of these is learning about the Holocaust. But in the UK, Holocaust Memorial Day not only commemorates the Holocaust, it commemorates all victims of Nazi persecution, and it marks all the genocides that have taken place since, in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. So at the heart of remembering the Holocaust, people in the UK learn that genocide did not stop at the end of the Holocaust. And of course, in January this year, as we marked the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, we were fresh from the knowledge that the indictment against Myanmar for genocide against Rohingya Muslims had been upheld in its initial stages of the trials. And since then, as Professor Bauer alluded to, we have learned more and seen more images coming out of China about the persecution of Uyghur Muslims. We see patterns of similarity as well as patterns of key differences. But the resonances today are not only those of near genocidal situations. As Professor Waller just said, we know the Holocaust did not start with gas chambers. It started with prejudice and anti-Semitism that was swiftly enshrined into law. Today, we see similar prejudices against people solely because of their identity, although, of course, very significantly, these are against the law, certainly in the UK. Just as an example, in London only a couple of years ago, 2 women holding hands on a bus, 2 women in a gay relationship, were not only verbally assaulted, they were physically attacked too. Disabled people are subject to harassment and discrimination on too many occasions, as are Roma people and other people from minority groups. Thankfully, all these actions are unlawful, but collectively, we must challenge this kind of hostility if we see it. I also wanted to touch very briefly on what we mean by education when we talk about learning from the Holocaust. At the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, we seek to make a difference to what people know about the Holocaust and about genocides, and what people feel, the empathy they feel towards the individuals who were targeted and persecuted, and also empathy towards other people today, especially people with whom they may have significant differences of opinion, of belief, of background. So when we talk about education, we mean not only knowledge of the facts and the figures, the dates and the accurate, robust historical truth of what happened, but also an education into understanding the impact that that history had on the individuals who were targeted. We also mean by education, adults and young people. Of course, young people have crucial roles to play in carrying forward the legacy of survivors who they are able to hear today, but whom future generations will be unable to hear. But I'm quite tempted sometimes to mount a campaign to hear it for the middle-aged. it's not young people yet who are running the world, it's middle-aged people. And my goodness, don't they need to learn about the Holocaust too? So Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK very specifically targets adults as well as young people to mark the day, to learn more, and to take action for a better future. And that civil society that we were talking about, we were referring to, in the UK sees 17,000 activities taking place to mark Holocaust Memorial Day in places such as prisons, museums and galleries, bookshops, libraries, offices, as well as, of course, schools, colleges, universities. There's such a diverse range of places that constitute civil society. And in the United Kingdom, they're all engaged in coming together to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, learn from genocide, and take what steps they can within their own positions and their own neighbourhoods to make a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. And again, your introduction provides a lot of food for thought to the rest of our discussion, not least concerning the paradigm of collective responsibility and collective action, and the need for promoting intercommunal solidarity, as you spoke to. So let us start from this. Our discussion today is somewhat premised on the idea of taking lessons from the past, looking at the November pogroms in this case and understanding how they can serve as lessons for today. That's not always a simple step, as you have both alluded to. Perhaps you could both speak to us about some of the challenges of using history to educate or legislate for future. And we'll speak about what overcoming these challenges looks like after that. Olivia, if I can come to you first on that.
Thank you, Ilan. Yes, it's a really pertinent question that many of us are wrestling with. Of course, there are many opportunities today with social media, with digital platforms and so on, but I think the challenges are really important. One of the challenges, very obviously, is that of witness testimony. It's been utilised so often with Holocaust education over the past several years. I think one of the challenges I think has always been not to rely too heavily on witness testimony, because whilst we wish to share the experiences of survivors while we are still able to, that needs to be contextualized within a broader history and utilized as one subjective perspective. I think there's a real challenge on how we can use witness testimony that was given in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, and which may be sitting in archives in Yad Vashem or the Sher Foundation or other places, British Library, how we can actually take those testimonies which may be accessed by high-level researchers and bring them to a wider audience. I think one of the other challenges, a really significant challenge for us today, is around, I suppose, often seen on social media, but the people who seek to deny the truth and the accuracy of the past and using ever more sophisticated means to create what's known as fake news or even deep fake news. So whilst that's not specifically a challenge of using history, it's a major challenge for all of us that is that we need to confront, and that is presenting us with different challenges as we seek to educate in an accurate and robust way. I think another challenge that we often see is that of history repeating itself, but in different patterns, has been said much more eloquently than I. We've all the speakers this afternoon have referred to the situation in Myanmar and the situation in China. There are patterns that we can see, but we know that history doesn't repeat in exact same ways. So to be educating for others in a way that helps them understand patterns, but also to see same principles, but taking place in a very different way in today's different society, I think presents another challenge as well. I think there are probably many more I could highlight, but I'll stop there and let James come in on the conversation too.
Thank you, Olivia. I'll just build a little bit on what she said, that in my work, when I look at issues of risk, what puts societies at risk for the possibility of genocide, one of the 4 categories of risk factors I look at is conflict history. And it's not just, has a society had a history of conflict or a history of genocide in its recent past, but it is the interpretation of that conflict history in memorials, in testimony, in legislation, and in school textbooks. And I do have concern about the way that history is used not to move us forward, but to keep us in the past, to keep us divided, to keep us stratified. And I think, for instance, of Bosnia and Herzegovina, coming out of its genocidal crisis in 1992 to 95, and today in Bosnia and Herzegovina, many children learn from one of 3 school books, Bosniak, Croat, or Serb, each with their own history that depicts their group as the victims, as the survivors, as the noble, heroic ones. And history used there in a way that forms some deep divides. And I think even in my country, I'm a child of the American South. It wasn't until college that I heard our Civil War described as civil war. Everything I'd been taught growing up in school was, it was the war of Northern aggression. It was the war against the states' rights in the South, with no significant discussion of slavery whatsoever. And I look at the ways that my own country is still trying to come past this divide over a history that many of us haven't been taught, over a history that many of us haven't acknowledged. And I think of all the wonderful ways, as Olivia's described, in which education can help us move through that navigation of history of conflict so that it doesn't keep us stuck or keep us at risk, but it helps to start to build bridges forward.
Thank you both for those insights. And I think I was mentioning earlier that I think your work very aptly complements the other, in that one is more focused on a structural approach and one is somehow more human-centered. And please object to that characterization. I'm sure you find bits and pieces of that in both. But I want to continue with you, Dr. Waller, on this structural framework on which you already pointed a few elements. When we speak of genocide prevention, I think the immediate association in many of our minds, particularly those who don't work professionally on this topic, is that of an already escalated situation. Yet much of the framework that you already alluded to when we speak of genocide prevention is around early prevention, before any escalation ever emerges. And these are steps that often speak to the general health of society. So perhaps we could spend a little bit of time with you highlighting what some of these essential elements are about.
No, thank you for the question. And I think this is one of the, to go back to the first question about lessons learned and how we apply them, I think during the time of the Holocaust, many people said, we didn't see it coming. We could not imagine it could get to this. If that was defensible then, and I think it's arguable how defensible it is, it's no longer defensible now. We have unpacked historically enough of these genocidal events that we have a very good sense of what leaves societies at risk. We have a very good sense of the process by which it unfolds. So for us now to say we just didn't see it coming isn't a defensible position. We know what to look for. So what I focused on in my work in terms of the structural things to look for, I've looked at 4 categories. One, as I've already said, is conflict history. How has a country been torn by conflict? And more importantly, how has it interpreted that conflict? Another issue I've looked at, a second category, are governance factors. How is a country governed? Is it inclusive? Is it equitable? Is it a stable democracy? Does it respond to the will of the people or just the will of the powerful? And this is a concern for us because we know across the world, democracies are in retreat in country after country after country. And we know how difficult it is to build sustainable democracies but from the standpoint of genocide prevention, we also know how important it is. A third structural category I focus on has to do with economic conditions. Again, it isn't that poor countries are more likely to commit genocide, but it's countries where the wealth is disproportionately spread, or it's in the hands of a few, and where many people feel impoverished. That social horizontal inequality across economic structures we know is also important. And then the fourth and final piece I focus on, I think in many ways, is perhaps the biggest piece, and that's social fragmentation. In other words, societies are so fragmented based on identity, religious identity, class identity, social identity, political identity, that the socially fragmented societies are societies ripe for the type of violence we talked about today, because they're societies where we already think of each other not as individuals, but as members of groups, of us and them, of mine and ours. And we've seen social fragmentation as democracy has declined. We've seen social fragmentation escalate across the world. This type of tribalism of social identities has become toxic in many corners of the world. And it's that social fragmentation that we think about as another structural factor. So for me, those are the four: social fragmentation, conflict history, governance, and an eye on economic conditions.
Thank you, James. And before we go on, perhaps you'll allow us to bring Professor Bauer back into the conversation. Professor Bauer, if you can hear us.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have no objection to what was said here by both Dr. Waller and by Olivia Marks. I think they are important contributions. But you know, my principle really in approaching these things is to do a reality check. And what you are talking about applies to countries where you can have some influence. In other words, not only to countries where it's a kind of liberal democracy, but even countries where there's some kind of impact of the outside world. And that is not the case with most of the countries that really form the majority of the human race today. And we are doing something which we have to, in a way, get rid of. We are using terms which are totally inaccurate. For instance, Dr. Waller used the term of international community. There ain't no such thing as international community. International, yes. Community, no. United Nations, they are nations. They are not united. We are kidding ourselves with words that have no meaning. Security Council. Council, okay. Security? Don't make me laugh. We are using terminology which has no meaning. We are using the term Holocaust, which means whole burnt offering to the gods. What on earth has got to do with the mass destruction of the Jewish people? We are using the term anti-Semitism. There is no such thing as a Semitism that you can be anti to. We've got to cut through that nonsense. We've got to see where we actually are. Now, the things that Dr. Waller and Olivia Marks have been talking about are important. They're very important. They're important for the communities where you can have some influence as, say, liberal Democrats of some kind or another, which is anything between social democracy on the left and serious conservatism on the right. But it doesn't go beyond that. Now, it's very important. I'm not trying to discourage the work that, for instance, Olivia is doing in Britain. I think it's extremely important and very laudable. but it's limited to the inhabitants of the United Kingdom. And when you talk about America, I already mentioned there are 70 million people who voted for Trump in America. They're not going to go away. They are there. If you had today a free election in Russia, I'm absolutely certain that the majority of the people would vote for Putin. If you had a completely free election in China, the vast majority of Chinese would vote for Xi Jinping, and so on and so forth. That is our challenge. And for that, we need, indeed, as Dr. Bauer said, an academic, more or less objective, I mean, as close as we can get to that, analysis of the situations, including all the elements that he mentioned, and he rightly mentioned it. I'm in quite agreement with him. But where on earth is the problem of economics with the Uyghurs or the Kazakhs in Xinjiang? Where is the problem of economics in some other of the genocidal situation? You mentioned a few genocides since the Holocaust. You didn't mention about 50 other cases. 50 other cases. I can tell you the cases. I have researched that. Where mass atrocities and attempts at genocide and successful genocide. Do you know that there are successful genocides in parts of the Holocaust? In Darfur, Darfur, Masalit, Zarawa, Tanjur, black communities no longer exist. And the Israeli government made an agreement just now with the murderers. Now, what does it tell me about the situation there and here? Do I come out and tell people what I think? Yes, I should. Yes, I do. It doesn't make me very popular, you can understand. But there we are. And I think that all that we are talking about this evening, the question of genocide prevention, has to be seen in a global view. Now, that global view does not discredit the view in the United Kingdom and the United States and Germany and whatever. No. But it has to include it has to include Guatemala. It has to include Colombia. It has to include the quite real danger of native communities in various countries being annihilated. That, I think, will make our case much more persuasive. And I think we should educate not only the young people, somebody said it here, and I quite agree, not only young people, as though only young people do the wrong things. It's absolutely wrong to say that. It's everybody. And I think that we should remember that.
Thank you, Professor Bauer, and thank you for putting on the table a few more quite thought-provoking questions. And perhaps, Professor Waller, you can help us unpack some of that. And we've spoken of the fact that there is genocide today. There has been genocide since the Holocaust. And you've shared with us a few of the elements that lead to genocide when we speak of early prevention. Perhaps, are there any red lines, any common threads that you identify in all these moments when we have failed to prevent genocide?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. The failure to prevent lesson is an important one. And for every case of genocide, we can talk about how the genocide unfolded in the process and so on, but I think equally important is to understand the lack of international reaction to it, the lack of global reaction, the lack of regional reaction, sometimes the lack of even national reaction. And I think in the work we do at the Auschwitz Institute, we're very concerned about the regional and global actions and reactions that we take in the face of escalating violence. And I think if you've asked Alina about a common thread, I think one of the common threads that's very difficult to work beyond is the notion of national interest. In other words, nations respond when they feel that there's an event ongoing that somehow fits their conception of national interest, which sometimes can be very narrowly defined conceptions of national interest. And one of the things we try to do globally is to work with our partners to help them understand that the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities is in everyone's interest. Even if you do not know in 1994 where Rwanda is in your home country, the prevention of genocide there is an important part of regional stability, which means it's an important part of global stability. So part of the way we've done that work at the Auschwitz Institute is we have strong regional networks. We have a Latin American network of genocide and atrocity prevention. We have an African network of genocide and atrocity prevention, and we're launching a Mediterranean network for genocide and atrocity prevention as well, with the recognition that regions fully understand and appreciate that in Africa, this is often said, for instance, when Uganda eats a bad meal, Rwanda gets indigestion. And what they're saying is we understand the regional implications. If a crisis like this impacts one country, it's going to impact our countries as well. So our point, to sum it up, has been to say, we work with states and state actors to help them understand why the prevention of genocide is part of their national interest so that they can avoid sidestepping it in that regard.
Thank you, Professor Waller, and absolutely, as you've spoken to, it's some very important work to fostering a broadening of the understanding of what constitutes national or regional interests. And yeah, thank you very much for your work. Ms. Marks-Woldman, perhaps I could come to you. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust operates in a space that thankfully benefits from being away from the dangers of genocide. How do you make the conversation relevant and current in that environment? And how do you get people to engage in a way that goes beyond history?
Thank you, Alan. And I want to pick up on what Professor Bauer said so powerfully just now. Yes, of course, we all need to be thinking about those places where genocide could be a very real and present threat. They're places that need our work. But to come back to our starting point with your question, Alan, as Professor Waller said, and I think all of us said earlier, civilized society doesn't happen by itself. It has to be actively encouraged and supported so that it doesn't fray, so that it doesn't lay itself vulnerable and open to the people who want to make division, who want to distort the past, who want to create a violent future. We have to be constantly working at developing those bonds of friendship, that nuanced appreciation of each other, and having those conversations. And on Holocaust Memorial Day, we open ourselves up to learn the robust academic history of what happened and to understand its impact on individuals. So we make it relevant in the UK by showing how, exactly as James started his earlier remarks, by showing those initial steps that were not challenged, were actively encouraged, were enshrined in law, and eventually led to the Holocaust. So we show people those stages, those 10 stages that led to genocide, and enable people to learn about those and understand the resonances today. When I talked earlier about the identity-based hostility that still pervades, it's crucial that people know that those are unlawful, and that we live in a society in the UK where we have a rule of law that makes that kind of identity-based hostility unlawful, but it doesn't make it not happen. It doesn't make it invisible. It still takes place, and we need to recognize that it takes place and to challenge it, and to challenge it actively, to understand it, and to show solidarity to people who are not like us, whether they are disabled or from Roma communities and so on. So we know that when these things happen, when racism, anti-Jewish prejudice take place, it's not a Muslim or a Black or a Jewish problem. It's a problem for humanity. It's a problem for everybody in society. So there are many opportunities on Holocaust Memorial Day for us to show people how this impacts them, and why they should be taking an interest in learning about this, and what they can do today to be allies and to show solidarity for others. And it's not only relevant for today, in some ways it's more important than ever, not only because living witnesses are passing away, not only because we're facing a very fragile and fractured world with a rise in populism, with a pandemic that is isolating people and making it physically difficult for them to join together and strengthen their communities, but also in the UK, the effects of Brexit are likely to lead to a very severe recession and all those associated difficulties. And as I mentioned before, very specifically, Holocaust distortion and denial on the increase, and an agenda from very many people that is actively about reducing faith in authority, reducing faith in academics and in experts. Those are very real challenges and very real dangers for all of us. And learning and commemorating the Holocaust and trying to prevent genocide has never been more relevant to people in countries where they themselves are not at immediate risk of genocide. So I hope that answers some of the question. I realize that you asked another part of the question, Alan, about how do we get people engaged? So I'll be quite quick. I talked before about young people and adults. Young people, without generalizing too much, so many young people we work with are amazing and so passionate about wanting to be involved in educating their peers about the Holocaust. And that's young people in schools and in formal education environments when they're having lessons and assemblies on the Holocaust and on genocides, but also those in informal education environments. We work a lot with youth groups and youth organizations, and also young people in young offenders institutions. It's astonishing. I've been personally astonished at how young people in young offenders institutions have really engaged with a lot of Holocaust education. And for my middle-aged campaign, we really work hard to engage adult audiences with Holocaust Memorial Day right around the UK. We provide them with a lot of ways that they can get engaged. So there are a lot of activities that some of them are very craft-based or food-based, educational-based, different ways in that people can join in with the Holocaust Memorial Day activity and learn more. So for example, there was a group within a National Health Service Trust that was a therapeutic group for people with different mental health problems. They took some of our resources in one of their regular groups. They learned about Nazi persecution of disabled people. They created a quilt between them during their workshop sessions and then donated that to a refugee centre. So there are lots of different ways in beyond the purely formal educational environments. I could go into more detail on that, but you may have more questions to pose either to me or to James or Yehuda.
Well, Olivia, I'd like to actually stay with you for a second and kind of piggyback on what you were saying now about making the history of the Holocaust relevant to today, teaching about these escalating steps, teaching folks about stories from the Holocaust where they could feel some kind of commonality there. But I would like to switch a little bit the question around and go back to where we started our conversation today with the November pogroms, and sort of the premise of the conversation so far and much of the pedagogy around remembrance lies in the question, how do we take the events of the past and make them more universally relevant? But could you speak to the reverse as well? How in teaching about genocide broadly and in trying to develop overarching frameworks, how do we keep the specificity of the Shoah and impress that upon the public that we're interacting with? So Olivia, I'll start with you, but then I'd like to move to James as well with the same question.
Thank you, Alina, and I'm sure Professor Bauer is the individual who has the definitive word on this topic. It's a balance for us at Holocaust Memorial Day to make sure that the Holocaust stays within the center of Holocaust Memorial Day. When I started at the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, somebody said to me, Holocaust Memorial Day is not just about the Holocaust, and it's not only memorial, and actually it's not only one day, but apart from that, it's a great name. And it was very true. Keeping it at the center of the day, it is fundamental to how we join the day and how we start commemorating it. But I think one of the earlier speakers said it was a starting point for so much. It was, of course, as Professor Bauer said, genocides have happened over millennia, but the term genocide was prompted by the Holocaust and also by what happened in Armenia by Raphael Lemkin. It came into usage prompted by the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials were such a starting point for international justice. So the Holocaust in so many ways is a starting point for how we can then reflect and learn from recent genocides and look at our world today. But it's also not a competition. It's not a hierarchy of suffering when we're marking other genocides. It's trying to understand the similarity of patterns that have led to the Holocaust and to recent genocides, and to try and understand those patterns so that they can teach us something about human behavior, of what has happened, and therefore what we can generate in human behavior to prevent those kinds of things from happening. So the steps that led to genocide are a key part of what we do at the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust to keep the Holocaust, I think your words were unique and specific, but also to point to patterns that have taken place with other genocides. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, and that's certainly a very delicate balance to try to strike. And James, if you could add to that.
I'm not sure I can add too much. I think Olivia captured it very well. I think for me, I'll go to two key words again. One is contextualization. It is understanding the context of the Holocaust and the history that came before it and after. When I taught my first course 30 years ago in the social psychology of the Holocaust, I remember very proudly sending off my syllabus to a well-known Holocaust scholar and asking him to look at it. And he wrote back and he said, "This is the worst thing I've ever seen. You have no idea what you're doing." And what he was saying to me was, it is a great syllabus on the Holocaust, but you lose the whole context of World War II. It happened in the context of World War II. And he was exactly right. I had pulled it out of that context. And because of that, I had harmed the teaching of it. And I've always remembered that lesson. I think we have a similar lesson when we pull the Holocaust out of context of all the genocides that have come before, all the genocides that have come after. It doesn't minimize it to place it in the context of a global history of genocide. I think in many ways, it minimizes it if you don't place it in that context. So for me, the contextualization historically is important. And then the second word I'd say, as Olivia said, is patterns. Every genocide, while they may not specifically repeat themselves, they rhyme. There's a pattern to human behavior, a pattern to how people respond to victimization, a pattern to what I work on is how people perpetrate these atrocities. There are patterns of human behavior there. And most importantly, there are patterns of bystanding behavior, patterns of why we continue to allow never again to happen again and again and again. So for someone who looks at genocide as I do and works on it from a comparative perspective, I think those are the two key crucial insights, are understanding the contextualization of the Holocaust historically, what's come before, what's come after, and understanding the patterns of human behavior that we see repeat themselves and rhyme across history of those genocides.
Thank you both for your comments, and certainly it's important to keep a nuanced discussion surrounding these issues of genocide and mass atrocities. And perhaps we can move on to our final question to you both. We'd like to end on a proactive note, and one, perhaps if we could hear from, and I know this is difficult, 1 or 2 sentences from each of you about what each and every one of us can do in our daily lives, perhaps, to be a more constructive part in enabling a world free from genocide. James, if I can come to you first.
I was hoping you were going to come to me second, but that's okay. I'll go first. I'd say two quick sentences. One is, be informed. Understand the places where the world is hurting today. I think the pandemic has made us all so self-aware and self-obsessed about being worried about the other people as a threat and just taking care of ourselves. We've become very just self-obsessed with it. We have to open our eyes and stay informed about the world around us and the many places people in the world are hurting. And then I'd say, secondly, in addition to being more informed, is recognize our own unique points of leverage. Every single person listening to this recording or this event, you have a point of leverage that none of the rest of us have. And recognizing those points of leverage, the ways you can make a difference that no one else in your world can make. They're specific to you. They don't require a degree. They don't require that you publish books. They don't require positions of power. You have points of leverage in your life right now that you can use to make a difference.
Thank you very much, James, for that. I'd like to, if we could bring back Professor Bauer, but I would like to leave the final remarks to him and now go to Ms. Marks-Woldman.
Thank you, Alina. I'm going to say I'll be very brief. You asked what we could each do. I'm going to extend that and encourage people to be as well. In terms of what we can do, I mentioned before that at the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, we try to make a difference to what people know, how they feel towards others, and what they do. So, as James said, I'd encourage people to do more to increase their own knowledge of the past, inform themselves, learn more, and take action within their own communities to be allies to others, to show solidarity. But at the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, we do pride ourselves on being a very values-led organization. We try to embody these values ourselves. And in fact, our theme for Holocaust Memorial Day in January is Be the Light in the Darkness. So as well as doing more to contribute to genocide prevention work, I'd really encourage people to be more. We can all be more empathetic, kinder to others, and be allies to other people. So do more and be more.
Thank you very much, Olivia. And I think that's a very good roadmap for all of us. Professor Bauer, please, you have the last word.
What I want to emphasize is that I have a problem with this discussion because on the one hand, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. They concentrate on societies where you can express an opinion, where you can influence people, where there are ways in which social structures can work. That's not the world we live in. That's a minority world. Now, it's very important. Now, I support it, as Olivia knows very well. I supported every effort by organizations in the United Kingdom to spread Holocaust education and so on and so forth. I think it's extremely important. But you have to take a global view. You can't do without that. And the global view, as Dr. Wallace said quite rightly, is very bad. It's very negative. And we have to face that. Now, one of the problems is when you do Holocaust Memorial Day, you then talk about everything except for the Holocaust. Not you, but some countries do. And I think there's a mistake. The specificity of the Holocaust cannot be denied. It happened to a certain people by a certain power, by a certain ideology for certain reasons. There are different reasons, different perpetrators in other cases. So when you deal with Holocaust Memorial Day, first of all, deal with the Holocaust. Now then you can connect the Holocaust experience with the situations with other genocides, and then you can say the Holocaust was a genocide. It was an extreme form of genocide, an unprecedented form of genocide, but it was part of a genocide situation for thousands of years. So it's both very specific and it's very universal. There's no contradiction there. And I think that should be remembered when we do what we can do in the societies that are open to us. Now, there are some, yeah.
I wanted to invite you, since in the beginning you kind of concluded on this.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, yeah. I have other ways of making my views known. Thank you very much.
Now, I would like to ask you a question. Since in the beginning you mentioned that there are ways of overcoming genocide, and you pointed us to the fact repeatedly that, you know, perhaps we are focusing too much on countries where there is the possibility to take action. Do you have a reflection on how to be constructive and how to engage more broadly and globally in these areas that are difficult and are not free?
Yeah, I think I said that. There is that organization of an international, intergovernmental organization that involves NGOs and individuals who deal with research on genocide and the Holocaust, called GAMAC, and I detailed that. I think that is a form of action that is open to us, and it's connected with Holocaust memory. It's connected through, for instance, I mean, Olivia knows this very well. The UK is a member of IRA, and the representative there is Lord Pickers. And when he talks the kind of language that I could talk. It's a language of both specific and universal. And I think that the way to approach it is precisely that. IRA is today a member of this trend, of the anti-authoritarian, anti-nationalist trend, although it includes countries that are nationalist. So we have a problem there, but we have to face that problem. And the work that you are doing in the United Kingdom and that Dr. Waller is doing in the United States helps to face that problem. So on the one hand, I'm very much in favor of what I heard from both my colleagues here, and I have a criticism because it is not global enough, not universal enough, not international enough, and not specifically Holocaust enough. Thank you very much.
So we take that point of striking the balance between specific and universal, and I would say that that was as well sort of our intention and our framing and mindset in coming into this discussion today. I'd like to thank all of you for this insightful discussion, and more importantly, for just the tremendous, crucial work that you're doing every day. And for those of you watching, we thank you for joining B'nai B'rith International today in marking 82 years since the November pogroms with this discussion on genocide prevention and the role that each and every one of us can play. Thank you very much, Professor Bauer, Olivia Marks-Woldman, and Professor James Waller. And thank you all for watching, staying tuned, stay safe, take care, and thank you very much.